The Galactic Maritime Council had always prided itself on maintaining what they diplomatically termed civilized warfare, a contradiction so beautifully absurd that it had become the cornerstone of interstellar relations for over 2 millennia. The Council's headquarters, a gleaming station orbiting the neutral world of Proxima Delta, housed the galaxy's most sophisticated bureaucrats, each one expertly trained in the delicate art of making genocide sound like urban planning. At the top of this carefully constructed hierarchy sat the Keth'var Dominion, whose approach to diplomacy could be generously described as aggressive negotiation with extreme prejudice. Their fleet commanders wore ceremonial armor crafted from the bones of conquered species. Their battle doctrine was written in the blood of pacifists, and their idea of a peace treaty involved the other party agreeing to die quietly. The Keth'var had perfected conquest through what they called systematic pacification protocols. Step 1 involved arriving at a system with enough firepower to rearrange planetary geography. Step 2 required a formal demand for immediate capitulation, delivered with the sort of politeness that made threats sound like invitations. Step 3, should steps 1 and 2 prove insufficient, involved demonstrating why resistance was not just futile but positively suicidal. This system had worked flawlessly for 800 years, turning the Keth'var from a minor regional power into the galaxy's premier nightmare. They'd conquered, annexed, or protectorated over 400 species, each conquest adding to their reputation as the sort of neighbors you really didn't want to annoy. Their success had bred a casual arrogance that treated mercy as weakness and compassion as a character flaw requiring immediate correction. Then humanity wandered into the galactic community like a lost tourist, asking for directions, carrying medical supplies, and harboring the dangerous delusion that shooting at hospitals was generally frowned upon. Earth's introduction to interstellar politics had occurred with the sort of dramatic timing usually reserved for bad theatrical productions. Human ships had emerged from hyperspace broadcasting mathematical proofs, classical music, and medical assistance, a combination that suggested either profound wisdom or complete insanity. The galactic establishment had opted for the latter interpretation, finding it safer than considering the alternatives. The humans had arrived with the wide-eyed enthusiasm of children at their first diplomatic function, complete with naive questions about why certain species were classified as acceptable losses and why medical neutrality was apparently optional. Their delegation had spent the first year asking uncomfortable questions like, "Why don't you just stop shooting each other, and have you considered not being horrible?" displaying the sort of idealistic optimism that made seasoned ambassadors reach for stronger medications. Earth's contribution to galactic civilization had been characteristically unconventional. While other species offered military alliances or trade agreements, humans had established the Terran Medical Corps, a fleet of hospital ships dedicated to providing aid to anyone who needed it, regardless of species, political affiliation, or ability to pay. These vessels were painted pristine white with massive red crosses, broadcasting medical transponder codes on all frequencies, while their crews took ancient oaths about healing rather than harming. The galaxy had found this touchingly primitive. Here was a species that had barely mastered faster-than-light travel, yet insisted on sending floating hospitals into war zones. Their ships carried no weapons beyond basic defensive screens. Their crews consisted entirely of doctors and nurses who'd apparently never heard of acceptable casualties, and their operating philosophy seemed to be that everyone deserved medical care, even their enemies. The established powers had watched with amused tolerance as human medical vessels responded to distress calls throughout known space. These ships would arrive at disaster zones with the punctuality of cosmic ambulances, their crews working tirelessly to save lives regardless of whose side those lives happened to be on. It was charmingly idealistic, like watching children play at being adults while the grown-ups conducted the serious business of civilized slaughter. The HMS Sanctuary had been responding to such a distress call when it encountered Battle Group Omega of the Keth'var 4th Fleet. The medical vessel was 3 days into evacuating wounded from a border skirmish between the Altarian Republic and Keth'var expansion forces, its cargo bays converted into emergency wards filled with casualties from both sides. Captain David Thompson, a former emergency room surgeon turned starship commander, had been running medical missions for 6 years, long enough to know that neutrality was something you declared loudly and hoped people respected. The sanctuary carried 923 souls, doctors who'd left comfortable practices to patch up strangers, nurses who could perform surgery in artificial gravity, trauma specialists who'd learned that trage was apparently the galaxy's second most common word after help. The ship's medical bays housed over 200 patients, including 47 Keth'var soldiers who'd been abandoned by their own forces after sustaining injuries that made them militarily useless. Fleet Commander Vex Keth'var intercepted the hospital ship during a routine patrol sweep, his sensors immediately identifying the human vessel's medical configuration and neutral status. The sanctuary was broadcasting on all emergency frequencies, its transponder codes clearly marking it as a non-combatant engaged in humanitarian operations. Every galactic convention, treaty, and basic principle of civilized warfare protected medical vessels from attack. Vex Keth'var, a veteran of 63 successful cleansing operations, saw the human ship as an opportunity to demonstrate Keth'var superiority, while eliminating what he considered a strategically inconvenient medical facility. The humans, in his extensive military experience, were weak. They healed their enemies, they showed mercy to prisoners, and they displayed the sort of dangerous compassion that encouraged resistance among conquered populations. The attack lasted 49 seconds. The sanctuary's defensive screens, designed to deflect space debris rather than military-grade plasma torpedoes, failed within the first 7 seconds. The medical vessel exploded like a soap bubble struck by a meteor, its hull plating scattering across space along with the dreams and lives of 923 people who dedicated themselves to preserving life rather than ending it. There were no survivors, there was no warning. There was no military justification beyond the simple brutal arithmetic that the strong do as they please while the weak die as they must. The galactic community's response followed 3,000 years of diplomatic precedent. Emergency committees were convened. Strongly worded resolutions were drafted. The Keth'var Dominion expressed regret that their patrol had been forced to engage an unidentified vessel operating in restricted space, a lie so transparent that it insulted the intelligence of everyone who heard it while simultaneously daring them to do something about it. Subcommittees were formed to investigate the committees. Task forces were assembled to monitor the subcommittees. The vast machinery of galactic bureaucracy ground into motion with all the urgency of geological processes, producing reports that accomplished nothing while sounding appropriately concerned about the tragic loss of life. Earth's initial response seemed depressingly familiar. Human diplomats filed the appropriate protests through established channels. Ambassador Michael Chen delivered a speech to the Galactic Assembly that was praised for its dignity and restraint. The human delegation requested a formal investigation, public accountability, and the prosecution of those responsible for what they termed an act of unprecedented barbarism. The requests were acknowledged, processed, and buried beneath an avalanche of procedural requirements that would take decades to navigate. What the galaxy failed to notice was the quiet mobilization occurring throughout human space. Vessels listed as civilian transports began displaying weapon configurations that suggested their cargo manifests had been somewhat economical with the truth. Ships engaged in scientific research returned to Earth with the sort of detailed tactical information that researchers rarely needed. The Terran Defense Fleet, officially consisting of 37 patrol vessels, was joined by over 400 ships that seemed to materialize from the outer darkness like digital phantoms becoming suddenly terrifyingly real. Admiral Elena Rodriguez had been preparing for this moment since the day she'd taken command of Earth's military forces. The former fighter pilot turned fleet commander had spent her entire career developing contingency plans for the day when humanity's faith in galactic civilization would collide with galactic civilization's fundamental indifference to human life. The Terran High Command had approved her operational protocols with the sort of grim reluctance that suggested they'd hoped never to implement them. The strategy was brutally elegant: respond to the destruction of a medical vessel by demonstrating exactly why medical vessels existed under special protection. If the galaxy wanted to treat human healers as legitimate targets, then humanity would provide a comprehensive education on the difference between healers and warriors. 437 ships departed human space in a formation that would later be studied in military academies as a masterpiece of tactical coordination. The vessels moved with the precision of a choreographed dance, their courses calculated to arrive at the Keth'var Homeworld simultaneously despite launching from 17 different systems. It was the kind of fleet movement that suggested considerable thought had gone into its planning, along with the sort of patience that made optimistic species very nervous. The human armada emerged from hyperspace above Keth'var Prime with the theatrical precision of a species that understood the value of dramatic timing. 437 ships materialized in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming white against the void, each one bearing the massive red crosses that had become humanity's signature. Medical symbols transformed into harbingers, promises of healing converted into guarantees of surgical precision. The Keth'var High Command's initial reaction was amusement rather than alarm. 400 ships sounded impressive until measured against the Keth'var home defense fleet of over 3,000 vessels, supported by orbital fortresses that could sterilize continents and planetary shields that had never been breached in 8 centuries of warfare. The humans had arrived with barely enough force to qualify as harassment, let alone invasion. That amusement lasted exactly as long as it took the first human vessel to demonstrate why underestimating healers was traditionally fatal. The HMS Retribution, formerly the medical research vessel New Hope, targeted the flagship of the Keth'var home fleet with something that human technical documentation prosaically described as a surgical strike system. The Dominion battleship Eternal Victory, 3 kilometers of armored intimidation bristling with enough weapons to crack moons, simply vanished. One moment it was there, broadcasting threats and powering up its primary cannons. The next moment there was a brief, brilliant flash and an expanding sphere of superheated plasma where the flagship had been. The galaxy received a comprehensive education in several important concepts over the following 7 hours. First, human civilian vessels had apparently been designed with rapid military conversion as a primary consideration, their innocent-looking cargo bays concealing weapon systems that violated multiple galactic treaties on the grounds that no rational species would construct such devices. Second, human tactical doctrine represented a fundamental departure from established galactic military theory, prioritizing efficiency over intimidation and results over dramatic gestures. Third, the species that had spent a decade healing the galaxy's wounded had been taking extremely detailed notes on anatomy, including the anatomy of starships, space stations and planetary defense networks. The Keth'var home fleet lasted 5 hours and 37 minutes. The orbital fortresses managed an additional 2 hours and 14 minutes. The planetary shields, those engineering marvels that had protected Keth'var Prime since before humans had discovered fire, were systematically dismantled by weapons that seemed designed specifically to counter every defensive innovation the Dominion had developed. When the destruction ended, the Keth'var Dominion's military infrastructure had been reduced to expanding clouds of ionized metal and regret. Not destroyed in the traditional sense of random violence, but dissected with the precision of surgeons removing a malignant tumor. The human fleet had taken apart 8 centuries of military development with clinical efficiency, leaving the planet intact but completely defenseless. The human ultimatum, delivered while wreckage from Keth'var's impregnable defenses was still cooling in orbit, was refreshingly direct. Fleet Commander Vex Cath'or and his immediate subordinates would surrender for trial as war criminals. The Keth'var Dominion would provide full restitution to the families of the 923 murdered medical personnel. The Dominion would submit to immediate inspection and reformation of its military doctrines under joint human-galactic supervision. Any future attacks on medical vessels of any species would result in what humans called proportional escalation. The Keth'var leadership, contemplating the smoldering remains of their supposedly invincible defenses, agreed with remarkable unanimity and impressive speed. The galactic community's reaction to what became known as the Keth'var adjustment oscillated between shock and existential terror. The humans had just demonstrated military capabilities that recontextualized their previous diplomatic restraint as the sort of mercy typically shown by apex predators toward harmless prey. 400 ships had dismantled the galaxy's most feared military power in less time than most committee meetings took to achieve quorum. The Galactic Maritime Council held emergency sessions that devolved into barely controlled hysteria. Intelligence reports were frantically reviewed, revealing the uncomfortable truth that human exploration missions had been conducting detailed reconnaissance of every major military installation in known space. Those medical missions that had seemed so endearingly naive had apparently been mapping defensive capabilities with the thoroughness of a species that understood intelligence gathering as a prerequisite to effective violence. Ambassador Keth'var of the Council found herself explaining to increasingly panicked superiors why their intelligence services had somehow failed to notice that humanity had been quietly constructing a fleet capable of ending civilizations. The humans, she reported with the careful precision of someone updating their resume, had spent a decade studying galactic military doctrine not to emulate it, but to systematically counter every advantage it provided. Treaties were rewritten with unprecedented urgency. The Universal Medical Protection Protocol passed the Galactic Assembly by unanimous vote in record time, establishing penalties for attacking hospital ships that ranged from economically devastating to "your species will exist only" in historical footnotes. The Terran military doctrine was added to every war college curriculum, teaching future officers that some species restraint should never be mistaken for incapacity. Fleet Commander Keth'var found himself standing trial for crimes against galactic civilization in proceedings that established several uncomfortable legal precedents. The trial was conducted by human military prosecutors who displayed the same surgical precision and jurisprudence that their fleet had demonstrated in combat. Keth'var was convicted, sentenced, and remanded to a rehabilitation facility staffed by human medical personnel who took their Hippocratic oath very seriously indeed. 2 years later, the galaxy had adjusted to what historians termed the Terran equilibrium, an era of unprecedented peace maintained by the universal understanding that attacking medical personnel was now the most efficient way to discover what human weapons could do to planetary geology. The species that had arrived as starry-eyed idealists had become the galaxy's reluctant enforcers, their hospital ships now operating under the protection of vessels carrying enough firepower to rearrange solar systems. Dr. James Morrison, chief medical officer aboard the HMS Healing, often contemplated the irony during his shifts in the ship's expanded medical bays. The galaxy had finally learned to respect medical neutrality, but only after humanity had demonstrated that healers could summon destroyers when their patients were threatened. The red crosses on human hospital ships were no longer viewed as symbols of primitive idealism, but as warnings written in the ashes of those who had learned too late that some mercy came with terms and conditions. The universe, it seemed, possessed a sense of irony so profound that it bordered on the sadistic. The Keth'var had sought to send a message by destroying a hospital ship, and they had succeeded beyond their most fevered nightmares. The message being that some species' compassion was not weakness but a choice, and that choice could be revoked with consequences that redefined the meaning of regret. In the end, the galaxy had achieved something it hadn't known in millennia: genuine peace, maintained not through the traditional balance of mutual assured destruction, but through the knowledge that even the gentlest species could demonstrate terrible precision when sufficiently motivated. The humans continued their medical missions, their ships still marked with red crosses, still crewed by doctors and nurses committed to preserving life. They just did so now with the quiet confidence of a species whose definition of do no harm had proved considerably more nuanced than their enemies had anticipated.